You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. Hello, and welcome to the Decisive Podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. As we approach 2025, we are reflecting on our key themes for 2024. In this episode, we're revisiting some key moments and insights from our previous episodes on the themes of supply chain resilience, resource security, and logistics rewired. Here's how Chris Rogers, head of supply chain research at S&P Global Market Intelligence, described the theme of supply chain resilience at the start of 2024.
The sad fact of the matter is you're never more than a few months away from some sort of significant supply chain disruption. That might not necessarily be something as big as what we faced in the past 3 years, which was largely the result, as we've discussed in the podcast before, of consumer demand during the pandemic, driving all kinds of upheaval in demand planning, in logistics networks, in inventory systems. But there's always other issues that emerge. And, that might be politics. Our colleagues in the risk team have mentioned over 70 elections in the coming year. Every election brings a risk of change in policy, whether it's trade or industrial or labor relations that can cause upheaval in supply chains. You can get, exogenous events, the war that we see in Gaza or in Ukraine. And then you've always got things like natural disasters, financial failure of suppliers. These are all things that pop up now and again. So whilst the pattern of supply chains has returned to normal, you can't assume that everything's going to be quiet and stable and easy. And that's why you need to continue to invest in resilience.
The team of economists who oversee our purchasing managers' indices explored supply chain resilience in an episode in March. Let's hear what PMI economists Paul Smith and Andrew Harker had to say about using the data to pick up signals of supply chain stabilization or disruption.
And I think supply chain resilience remains such a key topic for many people at the moment, especially in that post-pandemic world that we're living in now and in the context of current geopolitics and various tensions around the globe. Maybe we could just come back to first principles there, how we measure those impacts, Andrew. How do we do it through our PMI data sets?
So the best way of looking at it is to use the Supplies Delivery Times Index, which we have on all of our manufacturing surveys and whole economy ones as well. And with this index, what we're asking the companies to say is whether the amount of time it's taken for them to receive their goods that they've purchased from suppliers has quickened or lengthened, or in fact just stayed the same from the previous month. Just in terms of the interpretation, if we get a reading of the index above 50, that means that we're seeing shorter suppliers delivery times than the previous month. Conversely, if the index is below 50, then that means that lead times are lengthening and delays are getting worse.
That 50 really is the midpoint. Like you say, that indicates no change in a particular variable. I guess what's interesting then is we've got that number now, that 50 number. What's the latest results you're seeing on that index, say at the global manufacturing level?
Our global manufacturing PMI, which is in association with JP Morgan, we calculate that by amalgamating all of our national manufacturing surveys together and weighting them together to get that overall global figure. But if I take you back to January, actually, we saw the index actually drop below the 50 mark for the first time in a year. So that showed actually the first lengthening of lead times for a year. But then what we saw into February actually was that index moved back up to pretty much in line with 50, so signalling a bit more of a stable picture. So I think in contrast to what we saw in that post-pandemic era where we saw things start to lengthen and then it's sort of a domino effect where it just got worse and worse, maybe we're seeing a bit of an impact in January and then more of a stabilization in February, and that's sort of borne out by the comment tracker data as well. So this is information that we get from the companies we survey based on like anecdotal evidence that they put in, and we can track that over time as well. So reports of shipping delays in January are around 2.5 times the normal amounts, and that stayed pretty stable into February as well. So again, it's pointing to that sense that maybe things are stabilizing a bit.
Yeah, we've kind of seen a little bit of an impact, but as you say, things have stabilized. This is not like we saw 2 or 3 years ago during the pandemic. For context, some numbers were in the 30s, were extremely low readings when we had so much disruption from the pandemic. I guess what's interesting, though, is that obviously we said there's been some challenges in Greece, but at the global level, is it really quite a muted impact? So how are you reconciling that? Is it localized issues rather than a global problem? That's the reading that I'm getting from that.
So this is where having the PMI in so many different countries is really valuable, actually. You can really drill down and see where the pinch points are geographically. So if you look at, say, Asia, for example, we've not really seen any particular impact there from the trouble in the Red Sea. Over in North America, we saw, again, similar to the global level, a bit of impact in January, but then that eased off again into February. In Europe, bit of a mixed picture, really. So even in Europe, where you'd probably expect most of the impact to be. So we've obviously mentioned Greece, also the UK and Spain quite badly affected in the data there. But then other parts of the continent, for example, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, still seeing their supplies delivery time shortened. So even within Europe, it's quite a mixed picture geographically, depending on where countries are.
In our episode on back-to-school sales in the U.S., Chris Rogers walked us through the peak shipping seasons. Here's what he had to say.
So when we talk about the peak shipping season, there's actually 3 peak shipping seasons. The first one is very much linked to this back-to-school season, particularly around apparel. The second one is around leisure goods, so that's toys and Halloween and Christmas decorations and all that kind of stuff. And then the third one is electronics, when we get all of the whizzy new gadgets that are being announced over the next month or so. When we look at that first peak season, we are seeing an increase in imports of those back to school products to the US in the April to July period, which is where we really see that ramp up. And what we're seeing there really is 2 things. Firstly, there's a cluster of demand factors. Michael's talked a bit about that on the sales side. I think I'd also just note that this time last year, retail generally was going through a period of destocking, so reducing inventories, and that really suppressed the need for the shipping of goods. So we saw a slowdown on that. What we've also seen is quite a significant degree of early shipping. So this is effectively, if you're concerned about what's going to happen to your supply chain structurally as you go through the peak season, if everything's relying on these couple of months of sales, then perhaps you're going to take a more conservative approach and try and ship early.
Supply chain resilience is critical for highly sensitive sectors like technology. Here's what Chris had to say in a joint episode with our colleagues at the Next in Tech podcast.
Yeah, I think I often say that the semiconductor industry sits at the nexus of national security concerns and economic concerns. So if you want a strong, modern manufacturing industry in your country to provide jobs for the people who vote for you, then you need to be sure that the semiconductors that drive a lot of that manufacturing, whether it's computers or televisions or cars, pretty much everything these days has a chip in of some sort. So you need to know that from an economic perspective, you've got access there. At the same time, the national security element plays out in kind of 2 big product areas. One is very directly for national defense. So there were concerns in the US about 5 or 6 years ago that a lot of the chips that are used in head-up displays that are used in jet fighters are only available from a couple of producers in countries who are natural US adversaries. So whilst the jet was made in the US, the head-up display was made in the US, some of the semiconductors that were in it were bought from adversaries. So ensuring that end-to-end is obviously attractive from a national security perspective. The other element is then the future state of warfare, particularly around cyber warfare, and do you have access to the latest chips, and can you deny a potential future adversary access to the latest technology as well? So what we see as a result of that kind of combination of economic and national security issues is this desire to bring onshore, so bring back to a specific country, whether you're the United States, whether you're in the European Union, whether you're in Japan, whether you're in China, you want that full supply chain available for yourself for those reasons. And that's why we've seen the emergence of so many different types of policy approach. designed to ensure that's happening.
Supply chain resilience is also crucial for a successful energy transition. Here's how Jenny Paurys, head of Global Intelligence and Analytics, described it in a November podcast episode.
I think the way to think about this is that supply chains are both a critical conduit for achieving energy transition, as well as direct players in their own energy transition. So if we think about the dichotomy of that, when we think about what is going to be required for energy transition in the coming decades, it will be supply chains that are transporting those elements that are going to power it, whether you're thinking about critical minerals, finished goods, you're thinking about land, sea, etc. How those elements move across the world will be down to the functioning of supply chains. And then importantly, the other side of that is that in order to drive successful energy transition, supply chains are also direct players with their own emissions footprints upstream in their suppliers and downstream in the way that we engage with shipping and movement of goods, all the way from mining to delivery. So really one of the biggest challenges for corporate decision makers is managing that element and the types of emissions like Scope 3 emissions that come from it. Often that accounts for the largest share of a carbon footprint in a supply chain. And so we are talking about this today because really enhanced visibility across supply chains is going to be key, not only in helping with compliance, but also in covering those opportunities for innovation and efficiency.
That's a good segue into resource security, another theme we explored in 2024. Labor resources were very much in the spotlight this year. Here's what senior economist Sophie Malin of our pricing and purchasing team had to say about it at the beginning of 2024.
The softening of wage growth pressure is certainly a theme that we expect to continue into 2024. Global growth is set to slow further in 2024 as the previous interest rate hikes continue to subdue economic activity. This outlook of quite modest economic growth in 2024 will certainly put downward pressure on labour demand. But also off the back of that weaker economic activity, we're certainly expecting further improvements in terms of inflation. So where 2023 largely represented the peak of wage growth globally, 2024 will really be this era of wage growth deceleration. Now, one theme that is expected to continue in 2024 is tight labour markets. So like I said, we've seen labour demand come down, labour markets start to rebalance, but that's really very much been in response to labour demand softening rather than really any improvements in terms of labour supply. So we've still got underlying structural issues that continue to see labour shortages present in certain regions and in certain sectors as a result.
Let's zoom in on the labour market in one particular country, India. Here's Sophie speaking on a special September episode of the podcast in conjunction with the release of our Look Forward journal on India.
So we definitely saw that employment prospects certainly influence voter choices across Indian states. Just to put the Indian employment picture into perspective, according to our macro team, the unemployment rate was 9.3% in 2023, and the employment to population ratio was 53%. So India's objective really is to try and improve this picture, bring it to levels that we see in other countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and China, where unemployment rates sit around that 1 to 4% range, and then the employment to population ratio sits between kind of a low 60 to 70% range. Now, India's still got strong growth ahead of itself, but we've got a population that's continuing to grow and participation rates that are steadily increasing. So really the two major questions for India in the next decade will be how to create enough jobs to absorb that inflow of labour, but secondly then how to improve the quality of these jobs, because we really do have a high proportion of informal employment in India. And those are key objectives, but then another one is really to address the high unemployment seen within the youth of India, and we particularly see this in those that are college educated. Now, graduates in India are likely quite affected by the fact that there's a mismatch between the education they've received and then the skills actually needed in the market. This is for two major reasons. So, we've got graduates coming out of university or training with theoretical knowledge, but not necessarily those practical or industry specific skills that are really needed. But also, they've been focused in gaining service related qualifications, particularly those for the IT sector. But this is where we've seen a real sluggishness in hiring of late. Particularly, we've seen firms restructuring after previous quite strong hiring pushes. So what we've seen is really just the youth overlooking other sectors where demand has been stronger and where skilled labour is actually very much in need. So we could look to the construction sector, given the strong infrastructure investment we've seen in recent years, or in the manufacturing sector where we really do need skilled labour because growth's being supported by either the Make in India programme or the ongoing diversification of supply chains.
Spoiler alert for our 2025 themes episode, trade troubles and tariffs will be big in 2025. Here's what John Anton of our pricing and purchasing team had to say about the steel trade and tariffs in a July episode of the podcast.
The first thing is recently President Biden raised tariffs from 7.5% to 25% on mainland China, and there was a lot of question as to what the impact would be. Pretty much nothing. The United States already had such extreme anti-dumping and countervailing duties up to 570%. Adding another 17.5 is really a hiccup in a hurricane, to use the phrase once again. We in the United States started cutting back when the anti-dumping and everything came in 2014 and 2015. Even in 2017 and 18, when the 232 tariffs came in, we weren't buying steel from mainland China even then. It's not a non-issue globally. Mainland China had been exporting about 50 million tons of steel per year to all the rest of the world. As a point of reference, the world makes about 1 billion tons of steel. World, not China, makes about 1 billion tons. So this was 5% of non-Chinese steel China was exporting to the world. They've doubled their exports. It's up to 10% of global production. And the world economy is not booming strong enough to accept another 50 million tons a year of exports. So one of three things will happen, or probably some combination. The rest of the world will start doing protectionism against Chinese steel as the US did, or mainland China will cut production, or steel will keep flowing and it puts downside risk to the rest of the world's steel pricing. I have built into my forecast an expectation that the rest of the world puts in levels of protectionism. If the rest of the world does not introduce protectionism, then steel prices around the world are probably about $50 to $100 US per ton lower than my forecast. So what it really means for you for the rest of the year is chaos.
Let's go from chaos to coffee, which to me is a critical resource to secure. We did a couple of fun episodes in 2024 with economists Anna Rybicka and Agnieszka Maciejewska, including one on how our tea and coffee drinking habits influence trade in these commodities. Here's what Anna had to say.
So according to history and forecast, the winner of the World Cup is coffee. This is in terms of tonnage. According to the forecast, in 2040, coffee global trade in tons is envisaged to be 5 times larger than the tea trade. However, if we change the units from metric tons to cups, the competition gets tighter and the dominance of coffee is not observed in all periods. We need to consider the fact that 1 kilogram of roasted coffee beans can produce 111 cups of coffee, while 1 kilogram of tea leaves can produce up to 400 teacups. This changes the picture, making the dominance of coffee much smaller and periodical. We can see that the world exported similar amounts of coffee and tea in 2008 and in 2013. Coffee started to dominate in 2014, followed by a slight drop of tea export volume. In 2023, the world traded the equivalent of almost 758 billion cups of tea and 986 billion cups of coffee. Within the coffee itself, coffee beans are the winner. Coffee raw materials, coffee beans, non-roasted, takes the lead in terms of global trade volume. In 2023, raw coffee beans accounted for almost 72% of global trade, while roasted coffee made up 13% of the market. Robusta coffee has larger share than Arabica in the global trade, and black tea represents larger proportion than green tea, 76% versus 23%.
In another episode, Anna and Agnieszka used trade data to tell the story of cocoa imports and exports. You'll have to listen to the episode to find out which countries are the biggest players in the cocoa trade. But here's what Agnieszka had to say about how businesses use our trade data.
I mean, we were speaking about the seasonality and the type of products that are produced by particular countries. So it can be used for planning inventories and foreseeing the busy seasons, as we could just see. For particular commodities, we can break it down even more than we were speaking in the questions before. So we can look at the particular country and particular type of sweets and see its history and what we are forecasting the trade flows between countries would be. We can be looking for particular suppliers because we have a full comparison of the supply that is available in the countries. We can look for buyers, but also it may be very useful for logistic companies who are planning a particular fleet capacity to transport the sweets that we are craving.
Now let's pivot to the theme of Logistics Rewired. How goods move from point A to point B, or port A to port B, as it were, is essential to supply chains. Measuring port performance provides key insights to improving how supply chains function. Here's Turloch Mooney, who leads our port analytics team, explaining the Container Port Performance Index, which was released in 2024.
The CPPI, or Container Port Performance Index, is a data-based index that ranks global container ports by efficiency. It's based entirely on empirical data, the port performance data. And the latest index was released in June, and it ranks 405 global ports by efficiency. The CPPI metric is port hours, or ship turnaround time, which is the time from when a ship arrives at port limits until departure from the berth after completion of cargo operations. Port hours are cross-referenced with quantities of containers moved, so it effectively measures and compares the time required to complete particular workloads. The objective of the CPPI and the underlying data is to identify gaps in performance and opportunities for improvement. This is important because, as we know, ports are critical nodes in supply chains, and improving their efficiency has multiple benefits for stakeholders in the global trading system and supply chains, from shipping lines to manufacturers of products to governments, ports and terminals themselves, of course, and ultimately consumers.
In November, I had the opportunity to speak to Peter Tirschwell, Vice President, Maritime Trade and Supply Chain at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Peter leads the Journal of Commerce and is the founder and chair of the annual Trans-Pacific Maritime, or TPM, conference. The conference is coming up in March of 2025. Here's what Peter had to say about the presence of geopolitics on the conference agenda.
So the event was started in 2001, and so now it's 2025, so that's 25 years later. For most of those years, all the way up through COVID, essentially, or even beyond that, there would never have been a reason for us to have a speaker, let alone a keynote speaker, who was an expert on geopolitics. because there was no impact of geopolitics on containerized shipping. We were in an era of multilateralism, of acceptance of multilateral trade as a benefit to economies, and we had not yet transitioned into this phase we're at right now, where supply chains are strategic. There's national security, there's economic security associated with it, and the world is realigning itself from a geopolitical perspective, all of which is having and will have a profound impact on containerized trade. So therefore, 2 years ago, we had David Petraeus, General Petraeus, as our keynote speaker. Last year, we had Robert Gates, the former defense secretary and CIA director. This year, we have Ambassador John Bolton, who was the national security advisor in Trump's first presidency and also a former U.S. ambassador to the UN. And you're talking to an audience of people who are in the world of containerized shipping and containerized supply chains. And they're impacted meaningfully by what's happening in the Middle East. They could be impacted meaningfully by what happens in the South China Sea. They could be impacted meaningfully by any expansion of war in Ukraine, potentially. And so please interpret for us the big geopolitical events and realignments that are occurring in terms of its relevance for this world. That's what we're going to ask him. And so that's going to be an absolute highlight of the conference for sure.
Looking ahead to 2025, there's potential for another strike at U.S. East and Gulf Coast ports. Here's what Chris Rogers had to say about that in our Halloween-themed episode. Warning, this clip contains Halloween puns.
The strike's likely to be a zombie that arises on January the 16th. What we saw in the initial agreement, and the reason that the strike only lasted 3 days, was they reached a deal on pay. And pay deals are pretty easy. I offer 50, you want 75, I offer 62.5, we're done. The bigger issue, and really the reason why there wasn't a conclusion reached sooner, is over port automation. Most ports in the world now have a high degree of automation. So those big cranes and the big carriers that move things around generally are running robotically, they're dispatched centrally. For most US ports, however, there isn't really much in the way of automation. And obviously, as a labour union, you're concerned about that. For the ports, it's really necessary for automation to come through if they're going to become more efficient and compete. However, it is existential for the staff. So there are no easy answers here. Fortunately, the strike will be happening during the off-peak season, but we probably will still see firms preload some of their imports, particularly in terms of those seasonal goods that I mentioned, so seasonal apparel, also garden goods, all of those sort of things that you get in the March, April time. We may also see, depending on where government policy goes early next year, we may see more tariffs coming through. That may also lead importers to front load as well. So I say there's a reasonable chance that we get another wave of shipping coming through December, January time. Yeah, so we're not out of the woods yet. I think there's plenty of jump scares in 2025, whether it's the potential for strikes or tariffs or all the usual issues. But once again, logistics has found a way at using early shipments, and that's been particularly important for new franchises like Beetlejuice.
How many times did Chris say Beetlejuice in that episode? Well, you'll have to go back and listen to find out. And that's our look back on supply chain resilience, resource security, and logistics rewired in 2024, and the end of our 2024 in Review series. Next week, we'll explore our big themes for 2025. Until then. Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.